Now, most of you folks at home have heard of, witnessed, or possibly experienced firsthand the effects of a bitter sports rivalry. It all starts as good old-fashioned joshing between rival sports fans rooting for their respective teams, but then suddenly it erupts into total chaos. It happens at school sporting events all the time, where a loud-mouthed, overly enthusiastic parent just explodes on a coach or referee over a questionable call, which results in a visit from the cops and infinite embarrassment for whichever unlucky child is at the center of it. I have personally gotten into an extremely ugly argument online with toxic UFC/WWE fans that began over Ronda Rousey, whom, as you can tell, I happen to admire. And after 2 days of screaming and name-calling back and forth, I couldn't even remember how the argument started in the first place. Obviously, the nightmare scenario would have to be when such instances of sports rivalry-fueled rage result in actual physical violence. Prime example of this was in 2004 at the long-gone Michigan institution called the Palace of Auburn Hills during an Indiana Pacers-Detroit Pistons game. It all started off harmlessly enough with a small scuffle on the court between Ron Artest from the Pacers and Ben Wallace from the Pistons, and it probably would have ended there. But then an idiot named John Green, who was sitting in the stands, threw a cup full of beer onto the court. The cup hit Artest dead in the chest, and then seconds later, a literal riot ensued between the players on the court and over 22,000 sports fans in attendance. Small-scale arguments and large brawls resulting from some manner of discontent are both horrible and utterly stupid. However, I recently learned about what is probably the worst incident of violence triggered by a sports upset in the history of the modern world. The year was 1969. The place was Central America. Political tensions are at an all-time high between the countries of Honduras and El Salvador, thanks to land reform laws and immigration problems that resulted in the expulsion of thousands of Salvadoran immigrants from Honduras years before. Both nations are poised to go head-to-head in a series of 3 separate games in the 1970 FIFA World Cup qualifier, where the winners would go on to represent their nation in the World Cup the following year. The first match went down on June 8th in the Honduran capital of Tegucigalpa, where Honduras would ultimately win the game with a score of 1-0. After the game, it was reported that there were numerous brutal fights that broke out between Salvadorian and Honduran fans. A combination of the two teams' heated rivalry and the growing political tensions between the two countries. The second match occurred on June 15th in the Salvadorian capital of San Salvador, where this time the Salvadorian team had the home field advantage and won the game with a final score of 3-0. Sadly, even more instances of violence were reported between spectators that apparently started spilling into the streets. In fear of reprisals, an estimated 11,700 Salvadorian citizens living in Honduras were forced to flee in the weeks following the game, and there was apparently no action taken by the Honduran government to protect the fleeing immigrants from the ensuing violence. On June 27th, the third match went down in Mexico City, and the result was a decisive win for El Salvador with a score of 3-2. The Salvadorian team was officially in the running to win the World Cup. But this victory was tainted by very dark implications. The day before the June 27th game, Salvadoran President Fidel Sanchez Hernandez announced that he would be severing all diplomatic ties with Honduras due to the violence, which included widespread instances of rape and murder. He stated that since Honduras seemed disinterested in taking any sort of action to prevent or condemn the actions of the perpetrators of said violence, then there was no longer a reason to maintain relations between the two countries. Honduran President Oswaldo López Arellano didn't seem too concerned by the situation, and that would soon come back to bite him on the ass. On the afternoon of July 14th, weeks after their victory in that final game, El Salvador mobilized its air force, and using improvised bombers, they initiated an air raid against numerous targets in Honduras, including Toncontín International Airport, which would dramatically slow down any sort of retaliatory response. So in case you're just now joining us, El Salvador decided to get even with Honduras for the violence against their citizens during the FIFA World Cup qualifier by starting an actual war. On the end of that first day and leading into the following day, Salvadorian forces made incredible headway. After the air raid, the military launched an offensive against the two main roads leading in and out of both countries, initiating a full-scale invasion of Honduras. Shocked by the sudden incursion, Nicaragua's president Anastasio Somoza Debayle immediately took action to lend aid to Honduras by supplying weapons and ammunition to their military forces so they could hold the line. Those first 2 days ended with the Salvadoran military in spitting distance of the Honduran capital of Tegucigalpa, where their national soccer team had been handed a defeat a month prior. So it was that after 2 days of fighting, the war seemed to be over with El Salvador as the victor. But that sentiment wouldn't last long. On the morning of July 16th, the Honduran Air Force hit back with everything it had. Targeting their oil stockpiles and production facilities, the Honduran Air Force returned home at the end of the day after making the Salvadorian coast look like Pearl Harbor after December 7, 1941. For the next day, there were numerous skirmishes between Salvadorian and Honduran forces. The casualties kept piling up, and eventually Honduras just couldn't take it anymore. With the Salvadorian military in sight of their capital city, the Honduran government reached out to the Organization of American States and asked them to intervene in the conflict. The OAS immediately called an emergency meeting on July 18th, and after a few hours of intense brainstorming and negotiating, they managed to get both El Salvador and Honduras to call an immediate ceasefire later that evening, effectively bringing the conflict to an end. The resulting casualties of the 4-day-long war were 900 Salvadorans, 2,100 Hondurans, and a further 300,000 people rendered homeless. In the weeks that followed, the OAS managed to convince El Salvador to pull its troops out and Honduras to not seek any sort of retribution, provided that things go back to the way they were before the shooting started. Both sides did their part, and by August, the remainder of the Salvadoran forces pulled out of Honduras. As a gesture of good faith, President Arellano of Honduras made a promise to President Hernandez that he would henceforth provide more adequate protection for the remaining Salvadorans still living in Honduras. While both countries would suffer economic difficulties and political upheaval for years after, eventually both governments would work out some of their troubles and mostly move on from the event known today as the Football War. As for the 1970 FIFA World Cup, El Salvador was still allowed to compete despite starting the war, and they would ultimately be eliminated from the competition after losing the first 3 matches. So there you have it. An already volatile political situation that escalated into a war thanks to some very pissed off soccer fans. Granted, the conflict was already primed to happen even without the violence surrounding the World Cup qualifier, but it certainly didn't help either. So the next time you're at a sporting event and some drunken fool wearing a plastic hunk of cheese on their head says something that really gets your goat, just relax and remember the Football War of 1969. Then ask yourself if throwing that haymaker is really worth all the misery that may follow. If you like this video, then please show your support by dropping a comment below, hitting the like button, and sharing it with your friends. If you're curious about my future content and want to hear more extraordinary tales, then please subscribe to my channel and hit the little bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload something new. Until next time, have a lovely day, stay safe out there, and most importantly, look for the extraordinary!